The increase in organizing, covered actively in the press, of course, is the increased organizing that's led to a handful of corporate-owned Starbucks coffee shops that have been organized. As you know, there's also, if you're paying attention to the press, and I'm sure many of you are, there are organizing campaigns at various Amazon warehouses. There's two elections that are just occurring as we speak. One re-election at Bessemer, Alabama, at a large warehouse, 5,000 employees there, and another Amazon election in the New York area just occurring this week, and many other petitions for union representation elections at many other Starbucks. I think the count is over 100 Starbucks have seen some organizing campaigns, and then other Amazon warehouses, there's campaigns brewing. Okay, so what does the data and what does the research show? So one thing is just to keep in mind, it's not surprising, just as there are increased strikes and increased militants whenever the labor market improves and workers have more power. Historically, we know that union organizing tends to increase during conditions when the labor market improves. Workers become more aggressive in their demand. They're willing to take more risks associated with organizing and all. So in that sense, again, it's not so surprising there's more organizing activity going on. I think the question, of course, that you're asking and I'm asking is kind of, is this the start? Is this the tip of the iceberg? And we're going to see a massive increase in union success at organizing. I have my doubts. First, let me just remind you, the level of unionization in the private sector in the United States has dwindled down to about 6% of the private sector workforce who are eligible for union representation. People that don't have supervisory responsibility are eligible. Only 6% are unionized. There have been active campaigns over the last 20 years trying to reverse that, and what has happened is the decline in the share of the workforce represented has plateaued at around 6%, but it has not substantially increased in the face of increased organizing activity. So we shall see. This time may be different, but I have my doubts. And one reason I have my doubts is the fact that when you look at where other campaigns have occurred in sort of more traditional union areas where you would suspect the workers are kind of more sympathetic and sort of also able to be able to absorb the cost of organizing in manufacturing areas, we've seen many campaigns fail. Let me just remind you, at Boeing, a very active campaign by the machinists to try and organize their facility in Charleston, South Carolina, where they now assemble Dreamliners, failed. The UAW was unable to organize in a number of the new foreign-owned, what are called transplants, at the Volkswagen plants in Chattanooga, at the Mercedes plants in Alabama. Really strong campaigns were run in those UAW sites. I happen to focus a lot of my research has been about the auto industry. I and many others actually thought the UAW would break through at Volkswagen, because initially Volkswagen was maintaining a neutral position regarding unionization. They've since changed that position, but they were neutral. We thought the UAW would succeed. It didn't in the elections. By now, there have been several that have occurred at Volkswagen. So again, a reminder that it's not so unusual by historical standard that there's more organizing. It is somewhat different that the organizing is occurring in the service sector at places like Starbucks coffee shops, but it's not so surprising there's more activity. What I do want to mention is the question, again, that I think you're asking, and I'm certainly asking, and many analysts are asking, is there something different about what workers want now? Again, particularly at the coffee shops of Starbucks, where there's a younger workforce, what do workers want? What do we hear from them as to what they want? And here I do think there's something different happening that may lead to a different outcome down the road, although I'm not quite sure of that. But there's certainly it's a sign of something that's a little bit different than what we've seen in the past. And that is, it appears that what the younger workers want is more engagement. And let me just mention a few ways this shows up. In my own interaction with some of the baristas, the coffee shop workers who were activists in the campaigns in Buffalo, what they say is the following. They say, to my surprise, we actually love our supervisors. They're doing a great job and we want to help them do even better. What our anger is, we're angry about corporate policy. Specifics of which piece of corporate policy they're angry about varies by worker and work site, but in general, that's consistent with other things I've heard from people who were interviewing the activists at the work sites. And by the way, it's also consistent with survey research that my colleague at MIT, Tom Kochen, has been doing with his research teams. What Tom's research shows through expansive surveys of non-union employees is employees are now very sympathetic to collective action. This also shows up, by the way, in polls of various sorts. When you ask people, what do you think about unions? Their attitude towards unions have become much more favorable. So what does Tom's research shows? It builds on that observation that people are more sympathetic to unions and collective action. What his research shows is a sizable majority of non-union employees say they favor some form of collective action to improve their working life. But exactly what type of collection action they prefer, this is the key thing the research shows, is really, really varied. They don't always favor unions. And in particular, what shows up in the data is a significant number of the people who say they're in favor of some form of collective action. They're turned off by adversarial unionism. They don't want traditional unionism. What do they want? The survey evidence is they want more engagement. It's corporate policies that bother them. They want to be more involved in strategic decision making, or at least receive information about that. So I think what we see from that evidence is what you're facing, as I would put it simply, is a more demanding workforce, a feistier workforce, but not necessarily a workforce that ultimately is going to turn to collective bargaining to meet their demands, but definitely a workforce that expects more out of the corporation. Not so surprising given all the press about income inequality and the high earnings of executives, the high earnings of the super rich. In that sense, I'm not so surprised. It's consistent with this evidence that what employees are reacting to are corporate policies and not necessarily their relationship with their supervisor. I'm bringing this out because research in the past, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when I was starting in this field, when workers were surveyed about their views towards unions and organizing, they often said what's upsetting them is their relationship with their supervisor. When they were especially angry about that relationship, they turned to unions. But these days, again, the evidence seems to be people are being driven more by corporate policies, corporate practices, and all, and that's what's leading towards their activism.